In October, a couple stood at a grocery checkout line, staring at a number that didn't match what was in their cart. No steak, no expensive wine, nothing unusual. Just produce meat dairy, the kind of items people buy when they're trying to be careful. And still, the total felt wrong. What unsettled them wasn't just the bill. It was the feeling that this didn't start here. Not in the store. Not even this month. Most financial damage doesn't arrive all at once. It builds quietly, piece by piece, until one day everything shows up in the same place. And by the time you notice it clearly, the part you could have prepared for is already behind you. By the time that number showed up, nothing in their life looked broken. They were still paying their mortgage. Bills were on time. No emergency, no single moment that felt like a turning point. A few months earlier, if you asked how things were going, they would have said, "It's tighter, but we're fine." That word "fine" quietly shaped everything. They didn't make one big change. They made small ones that didn't feel permanent. Fewer dinners out, a subscription canceled, a trip postponed. The extra money they planned to invest stayed exactly where it was. Each decision felt reasonable on its own. That's what made it hard to notice, because they weren't reacting to one problem. They were adjusting slowly to several problems that hadn't fully arrived yet, and nothing about that felt urgent. A few months earlier, summer just felt expensive. When they checked flights for a short trip they had been planning since spring, the prices were higher than expected. Not outrageous, but enough to make them hesitate. They refreshed the page, waited a few days, checked again. Nothing changed. Behind the scenes, fuel costs had surged roughly 85%. But from where they were sitting, it didn't look like fuel. It looked like timing, demand. Maybe they picked the wrong week. So they waited. At the same time, they were thinking about refinancing. Rates were supposed to come down this year. That was the assumption. Then the tone shifted. Now, some economists were saying the first cuts might not happen until the third quarter at the earliest. If inflation rose again, rates could even go higher. So they paused, not out of fear, just uncertainty. Then, one night, it showed up on a screen. Not a crash, just a pattern. The S&P 500 was down nearly 7% from its January peak. The Dow had logged 4 straight losing weeks, the longest in 3 years. The Nasdaq was close to 10% down. The Russell 2000 had already crossed that line, falling more than 10%. Individually, none of it felt extreme. Together, it felt different. He kept scrolling, switching between charts, trying to decide what it meant. Not what was happening, but what to do about it. That's when the thought appeared. Maybe we should move some of it to cash. It sounded calm, reasonable. She didn't answer right away, because she had thought the same thing earlier. And that's how it begins. Not with panic. With two people quietly agreeing that doing less might feel safer than doing nothing. Before any of that, there was a smaller number that barely stood out. It was at a gas station. The national average had moved from under $3 a gallon to about $3.70. In California, it passed $5.30. Diesel, the fuel behind most deliveries, had surged 36% to nearly $5.10 a gallon. Those increases were real, but they didn't feel serious. The average household spends about $2,500 a year on fuel, roughly $50 a week. So when that rises by $10 or $15, it doesn't force a reaction. It gets labeled annoying, but manageable. And once something is labeled that way, it shapes everything that follows. You don't stop. You adjust, quietly. What looks like a small increase isn't just a cost, it's the first signal. The problem wasn't the number, it was where the number went. When that extra $10 or $15 showed up, it didn't change how they saw their entire situation. It stayed inside one category: gas. That's how people think about money, not as one system, but as separate pieces. Fuel, groceries, entertainment, savings. And when one piece grows, you don't rebuild the whole structure. You cut something else. Dinner out disappears. Plans get smaller. The gym gets canceled. The extra investment never increases. None of those choices feel connected to gas. But they are. Because once a required expense rises, your brain protects what it considers essential. Everything else gets pushed aside without a discussion. And that's where the real cost begins. Not at the pump. In everything you quietly stop doing. By the time the grocery bill changed, the shift had already been happening. Not in the store. On the road. Produce, meat, and dairy don't move themselves. They arrive on trucks, and those trucks run on diesel. When diesel rises 36% to nearly $5.10 a gallon, the cost doesn't stay in transportation. It moves forward. At first, stores absorb it. They don't raise prices overnight. They wait. But many had already been absorbing higher costs from tariffs the year before. Their margins were thin. There wasn't much left to absorb. So the pressure builds quietly. Each delivery costs more. Each shipment carries more weight than it used to. And then, slowly, the shelf changes. Not all at once, just enough week by week until the total feels different. The part that never felt connected was already locked in. It didn't move with weekly prices. It moved on a delay. Fertilizer. Up to 80% of its production cost comes from fossil fuels. And many of the countries tied to that supply, Iran, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, were directly involved in the disruption. At the same time, about 1/3 of the world's fertilizer moves through the Strait of Hormuz, the same route that had been shut down. So farmers were paying more long before consumers noticed anything, which means the food arriving in September and October was already more expensive months earlier. But no one reacts to something they can't see yet. That's what makes it dangerous, because by the time it shows up clearly, the decision window is gone. What they saw at the gas station was only the surface. Behind it, the scale had already shifted. Higher gasoline and diesel prices were costing the American economy an additional $500 million every single day. Not per month, not per quarter, per day. Since February 28th, oil prices had surged more than 50%. Brent crude was trading above $110 a barrel. Just 3 weeks earlier, it was around $70. And the Strait of Hormuz, moving about 1/5 of the world's crude oil and natural gas, had been effectively shut down. None of that appears all at once in daily life. So the mind simplifies. It anchors everything to the number it can see. $3.70, $4.20, $5.30. And because that number feels manageable, the rest of the situation gets underestimated. The shift didn't look like panic. It looked like hesitation. They stopped making forward decisions, not because something had collapsed, but because the future felt less predictable than it did a few months earlier. The expectation had been clear interest rates would start coming down this year. That changed. Now, some economists projected the first cuts might not happen until the third quarter at the earliest. If inflation picked up again, rates could even move higher. That uncertainty spreads faster than any single price increase. Mortgages feel heavier. Car loans feel riskier. Credit card balances feel more expensive than before. So people pause, not out of fear, out of doubt. And when enough households pause at the same time, the economy doesn't break. It slows. What makes this dangerous isn't just the situation, it's the instinct. When markets drop, the reaction feels logical. Protect what's left. Reduce exposure. Wait until things stabilize, because losses don't feel neutral. They feel heavier. Across major geopolitical conflicts since World War II, markets have declined about 6% on average. In the first month, losses have been around 0.9%. That part feels real, but it's incomplete. Over the following 6 months, returns have averaged about 3.4%. The problem is timing. The worst days and the best days tend to cluster together. Miss just 10 of the strongest days over 20 years, and returns get cut roughly in half. So, the move that feels protective often locks in the loss. There's a version of this that doesn't resolve quickly. Not a crash, something slower. Stagflation, when inflation rises while growth weakens at the same time. It's difficult because the usual fixes don't align. Raise interest rates to control inflation and growth slows further. Lower them to support growth, and inflation can accelerate. Right now, that tension is already forming. If oil prices stay elevated, some projections suggest Brent could approach $130 a barrel. At that level, the impact moves beyond inconvenience. It starts to reshape how households spend, how businesses price, how the economy moves. History tends to follow a pattern. Major oil shocks have often been followed by economic downturns, not immediately, but often enough to matter. By the time everything feels obvious, it's already expensive. Not impossible to deal with, just harder. The people who navigate periods like this better don't wait for clarity. They move earlier when the signals still look small, not with dramatic changes, with quiet ones. They review spending before pressure forces them to. They build an emergency fund that can cover 6 to 12 months of expenses. They keep investing instead of reacting to headlines. They reduce high-interest debt while borrowing costs remain elevated. None of that feels urgent at the beginning. That's why most people delay it. Because the first signal never feels like a warning. It feels manageable. And that's exactly when it matters most.